All right, welcome back. This is the room C here with climate, carbon, and soil health. And to get us started for the afternoon session, we got Mike Estadt. He's OSU Extension, Pickaway County educator here talking soil carbon marketing opportunities for farmers. So Mike, here you go.
Thank you. And I'll go ahead and set my timer. I got 25 minutes. I know I got 30, but again, thanks for the invitation from the committee. Thank you to all our sponsors. I know Marlene stepped out. Yeah, I will talk briefly about 45Z and carbon intensity scores because it's related to everything you've heard today. I was glad that Rafiq was here this morning to give you the science of everything that's going on. Now I'm going to give you the reality of what's happening out on your farms. So go ahead and get so I'll real quick. I have a coupon, a corn growers coupon that I guess I should put on eBay. It's worth $200. So I don't raise corn, but I have the coupon. A little bit about what I'd like to talk about. You know, why these carbon marks have come on the scene. I think I've spoken here once or twice. And the presentation's not the same as it was 2 years ago because it's changed a lot. I'll touch upon credits and inserts, how ag is expected to participate, some inherent risk. Now, the one thing I do remember about being up here one time, there was a lot of no-tillers in the room. There are here today. And they all walked away kind of pissed off because I told them they were going to be able to participate in an offset market. Well, we're going to talk about some things today that they can't participate in. So that's how much things have changed. So you're either going to leave her excited, mad, uneasy, enriched, excited. And if you don't, then I haven't done my job. So there's going to be a wide range of things. So what has brought us to this point? We really had a lot of mandatory emissions that were brought on during the 70s and the 80s. Utilities and manufacturers were, the old cap and trade days. So if you were a large emitter, you were pretty much capped on how much you could split up your smokestack. And so if you had another utility down the road that wasn't emitting all that it was allowed to emit, then you could trade emissions. So that's the old cap and trade. Then this thing called the California Emissions Board. If you followed this very long at all, a lot of the offset markets and a lot of the things that we see happening are related to the California Emissions Board. I was on some hog farms in western Iowa a couple years ago that have methane digesters on them, and that methane was being cleaned and put in the pipeline. Now that gas never made it to California, but the California folks that were using natural gas got a credit for gas that was generated in western Iowa. Then we come to these voluntary emission reductions. And so the Paris Accord was really the first inkling of this. The United States and most other developed countries agreed to do something about climate change. And they were going to make pledges to be carbon neutral 2030, 2040, 2050, whenever that is. So there was a lot of net carbon neutral pledges made. The one most recently, and there's some news on this one this past week, the Security and Exchange Commission was going to require publicly traded companies to publish a carbon emissions report. So if agriculture really got concerned because you all raise commodities to go into the consumer packaged goods industry. So the Mondeleses and the Keeblers and PepsiCo's of the world got concerned because they were going to have to collect your carbon footprint. Well, the SEC last week decided that publicly traded companies only have to report their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So what they directly emit and what is emitted due to the power they require. So ag, you're not going to have to put a carbon intensity score on what's going into this being bought by publicly traded companies yet. But the big one right now is environmental social governance. And so ESG. So show of hands, everyone heard this terminology, ESG? Okay, so I guess ag, or we're all working in the agenda we're working into, It's really here on the environmental side is what is your carbon footprint? Do you have a climate change strategy, water management, greenhouse gas emissions, and are you using renewable resources? So companies and investors in particular are looking to invest in companies that have an ESG policy, and in most cases, they're looking at the environmental side. So a lot has changed in that environment too. So this is what really was being said on the sideline at the Super Bowl. I found that out here just not too long ago. So always good to put a little bit of humor in a presentation. So just a reminder, offsets are basically tradable certificates in the market that compensate for your greenhouse gas emissions. So if you're not willing to either cut back or remit less, you can go out and you can buy a certificate that allows you to do that. And so that offset is like somebody is going to have to sequester that carbon somewhere, whether it's in the soil, whether it's in some trees, or whether it's in reduction of greenhouse gases that you may emit. So again, that's the offsets. I'm not going to talk a lot about that. This slide I had in the presentation a couple years ago, things really looked like they were going to take off. A lot of investor money and large banks were all going to make a big commitment to offset market. So what is the reality of the day? This is some pictures I took here recently. The investors are disappointed as JP Morgan, Asset Management, and State Street exit CA 100. Does anyone know what CA 100 is? That's Climate Action 100. It's 100 of the largest money management companies in the world had made pledges to invest in environmentally low carbon projects. The biggest one being BlackRock. BlackRock manages about $9 trillion. BlackRock had left the CA 100 a couple weeks prior to this. So the money is not too keen on offsets right now. There's no return to their investment. So people are exiting it. BlackRock has decided maybe their strategy is DAC. That's direct air capture. So they got a project with Occidental Petroleum. You can see Shell has scrapped out their offset plan. So these are some of the companies that were buying the most offsets: ExxonMobil, Shell, because they're big emitters. So it looks like maybe offsets are a little offset. Talking about ESG, this was a slide from the Netherlands when they decided they were going to reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that was being emitted by the dairy industry in the Netherlands. So what did the Dutch farmers decide to do? They went to the streets and they protested. That's a couple years ago. This is just last month. The EU has a big Green Deal plan, and I think there were protests in Paris. They finally got to Brussels. They were in Portugal. They were in Italy. And so, again, agriculture is in the headlights or in the spotlight there. So anyway, I didn't know where really to put methane at because it seems to be one of those things, unless you have a lot of dairy cows, it's not of interest. But I think it's interesting in the fact that I've shown this slide. Hope that's not mine. Nope. But these pictures are taken in New Zealand and in Ireland. I don't know if you can't really see very well, but here's a cow who has like a plastic flapper cap over its nose. There's actually a methane detector there. And when it detects methane, there's a small lithium battery in there with a spark, and it will literally flare the methane at the source. This is legitimate. This is all research. This is about the only research I'll have today. Here's a case in Ireland where, again, she has a halter on, and they are collecting the methane as she burps, and they're storing it on tanks up on her back. And then we're familiar with digesters, but even digesters are starting to change. And again, they're here because of the low carbon fuel standard and renewable fuel standards that have been put in. You can literally create RIN credits with methane digesters. Here's a picture of one. Again, they clean the methane to the point where they can actually put natural gas into a pipeline. There's this system here. I'm going to show you a picture of here in a second. The bar core system. There is one in Prairie States Dairy in Indiana. Anyone familiar with it? Don DeYoung owns that. I know Don real well. I served on a board with him. What's interesting about this, they take the manure and under heated pressure, basically steam, they distill the ammonia out of the manure. They actually get potable water that can use back into the system to water the cows. But in the case of Prairie States, they're using it for irrigation. And then they dry the solids that are left. Through that process, they get pathogen-free, seed-free dry manure. So it's under heat under pressure. I think that system is $10 million. So it's not going to be for the 100-cow dairy. And that's been some of the criticism that we've heard about some of the programs, especially as it relates to methane. I'm going to talk about climate smart here a little bit, is that a lot of these climate smart projects favor large-scale animal agriculture. So what are the things that we ask farmers to do if you're interested in an offset market? You've heard this all day today, all day yesterday. No-till, use of livestock manures, cover crops, and can you manage your nitrogen timing to a different time of period to reduce the amount of nitrous oxide that may come off? So those are the 4 things. If you're interested in an offset market and you're going to enter into a contract, these are going to be probably the 4 things that are very common to most of the contracts. So that's, again, no-till or reduced till, livestock manure instead of synthetic fertilizer, time your nitrogen, 4 R's, and cover crops. We want to grow as much biomass as you possibly can. This is a little bit of a dated slide. These carbon credits sold to date. Again, forestry and land use has been the #1 program and projects. Agriculture there, it says 1%, but I would guess it's probably closer to 2% today of all the credits that have been sold have been agricultural. But it hasn't been without hiccups. And I know Carbon by Indigo is here today, but it's, what I see and what I read is that at one time, Indigo Ag had almost a $2 billion evaluation, and it's not there today. So they've had they were making payments before they sold the first credit, and it's part of a loss leader system to buy a market, which is okay. Grocery stores do it. Home Depot does it to get you in the store, and that's what they're doing, trying to get you in the store. Questions about offsets? Okay, we're going to talk about inserts. Again, this is the Scope 3 emissions. So that's through a supply chain, every amount of greenhouse gas that is emitted. I have used the example of chocolate a lot. Hershey looks at a candy bar. About 10% of that candy bar, the direct emissions, of the total emissions, is in the direct manufacture of the chocolate bar. 90% of their greenhouse gas emissions go all the way down the land where, indigenous people are chopping down the rainforest to plant cacao. And so when they do that, they slash and they burn and they emit a lot of carbon. So again, think about the supply chain. And so we're going to talk about CI here in a little bit. Nestle announced about 6 months ago, Nestle got out of the offset market and they're going to focus on the inset or the Scope 3. They're going to try to transition 100,000 acres of wheat into a regenerative ag program. This isn't too far from here. They're working with ADM in Ardent Mills in northern Indiana, southern Michigan, maybe northwest Ohio, I'm not sure. But does anyone know? I know that says it, DiGiorno Pizza. So there's the DiGiorno Pizza manufacturer in Indiana that is going to buy this flour that has an information or a data trail with it in order to be able to advertise earth-friendly, climate-friendly, low-carbon pizza. So this is a good example. I gave a program in Minnesota about a month ago, PepsiCo, that's sugar beet country, PepsiCo and Pivot Bio have a program where they want farmers that are growing sugar beets to use sustainable practices so that the sweetener that goes into their soda is low carbon. I didn't realize PepsiCo also owns Frito-Lay, right? You know how many snack chip companies or products they make all over the world? They're working with about 6,000 potato farmers to do the same thing. So we'll talk about that a little bit when I talk about the climate smart commodities. And again, this is kind of the goal. This is an orange juice bottle or a carton from Europe that actually has a carbon score on it. And it's this, in this case, 360 grams of CO2 compared to the average is 240. So if the consumer really wants to shop eco-friendly, this is the way they can do it. But this is where I take the university hat off, and this is my own personal opinion. I've yet to go into a grocery store and have anyone shop the chicken based upon a carbon score. You know, so this might happen. It's generally what happens in Europe. She has a way to come across the water. But, you know, so someone eventually is going to have to pay for all this. In the case of the orange juice in Europe, it's the consumer. I still like this slide. I've used this slide for 3 years. And finally, I've actually seen this commercialized. Again, if you haven't heard, a lot of shipping companies are using inflatable sails in order to transport raw commodities back and forth. Everybody in that supply chain will be able to take a little bit of a carbon credit. If you're interested, these sails are made by Michelin Tire. They're making sails today. So, questions on that? Talk a little bit about programs, what they're based upon. They're generally based on either on one of two things: practices adopted or outcomes achieved. Anyone want to guess what the difference is? What's the difference between a practice adopted or an outcome achieved in a carbon program? Exactly. I'll tell you real, but you're right. It's like all you got to do is out and go no-till, or all I got to do is put a cover crop out. And that's all you really have to do. If you're going to do outcome achieved, you're going to do things like what Sean Lucas and Rafiq are doing. They're going to do soil testing. But the biggest thing is what you're going to get paid. Okay, so if it's just as simple as just going out there and I'm going to no-till this year, or I'm going to put cover crops out this year, you might get $3 an acre, $6 an acre. If you go into a program where they're going to soil test, you're going to get paid more. You're probably not getting paid enough. Overall, I would guess the number today is $30 a ton. That's the number of most of these programs. So I've really didn't edit this much. I did take a few of the minor ones out, but I know that these programs are active in Ohio and Indiana. And I apologize, maybe not big enough, but Agoro, Carbon by Indigo, Trutera's here today. Locust Ag, I think Locust was here last year. Soils and Water Outcome Fund. Cargill has a program, ESMC, to name a few. And Bear Crop Science has one too. And then Farmers Business Network. A unique one, and the only reason I want to point this one out is, does anyone know the history of FBN? Are they a bunch of ag guys, started an ag company? They were selling seed and fertilizer. They were selling they're selling crop insurance. Does anyone know anything about that company? Where they came from? They're a bunch of ex-Silicon Valley people. They're all computer programmers. Now, the reason I say that is because it's very, very important. All these programs are based on one thing and one thing only: your data. So when Pepsi wants to buy sugar beets from Jim Bachman in Herman, Minnesota, they really aren't buying the sugar beets. They're buying his information. They're buying how much fertilizer he put on, how many trips across the field. That's what they're buying. They're buying the data. so they can calculate the amount of greenhouse gases. So, but that's again, and Nori, I mentioned Nori. Nori's another Silicon Valley startup, and they'll pay you in their own Bitcoin. So I can tell you one of the biggest people that I know is in a Nori program. A group of us went to Eastern Shore of Maryland last spring, and Trey Hill, Harbor View Farms, look him up, 10,000 acre farmer. And you drive to Maryland, you go to Eastern Shore, every acre has cover crops on it. He is in a Nori program. Now, how did they achieve 100% cover crops in the Chesapeake Valley on the Eastern Shore? How was it? Well, it was called the flush tax. Every citizen in Maryland pays on their water bill the flush tax. And they use that money to get cover crop adoption. We asked Trey what that amount of money was. It's $100 an acre. 100 now. That makes our $40 an acre look pretty bad, doesn't it? So if you want to achieve 100% adoption of cover crops, pay $100 an acre. It will happen. I want to mention this one, and I know the slide's a little bit hard to see on the screen, but ESMC is a 501c3, and it's got a lot of ag companies involved. They're in the carbon credit business. Over here on the left, you see you're founding a lot of ag companies. But what I want you to look at over here is the amount of food and consumer packaged good companies. PepsiCo, Kimberly-Clark, Tyson, Mars, McDonald's. You've got Danone or Danone. I mean, there are a lot of people here that are in the food business. And that's, when we talk a little bit about climate smart commodities, I'll mention those again. But questions on inserts, scope 3. Okay. Okay, I better hurry through. Inflation Reduction Act, $300 billion in energy and security and climate change money over the next 10 years. 20 billion of that into conservation programs that sequester carbon, 10 billion into renewable energy, including carbon capture and storage, sustainable aviation fuels. That was involved with the Inflation Reduction Act. That's federal policy. There was $300 million for REFIC to write grants for in order to how do we really measure carbon sequestration in our soil. So that's out there too. Sustainable aviation fuels, 45Z. Current CI score is calculated using the GREET model. Again, that's just a measurement of greenhouse gases from farm gate. Well, basically, I'd say it wheel to wheel, from the farm tractor wheel to when it goes into the blended pump and everything in between. So we do a life cycle analysis of all the greenhouse gas emissions. The model is currently being updated. It was supposed to be released on March 1st. Well, it's March 12th, right? But there was a gentleman here earlier asked about who was doing the model. Well, it's Department of Energy, Department of Defense, the EPA, USDA. And so when you get that many government agencies involved, they all have their priorities. And there's some stuff leaking out that may not be real good for this, as far as if you've converted any farmland recently, that there's no way that it's going to score very well on the GREET model. So, well, no, there's the actual Congressional Research Service. If you're interested, it tells you all about the Clean Fuel Standard, 45Z. So I want to talk, and this is the very first sustainable aviation fuel plant. It's in Soperton, Georgia, Lanza Jet. Aaron and I talked a little bit about politics, and since Randall opened the door, why is there a sustainable aviation fuel plant in Georgia? It's a corn deficit state, right? So these plants just don't happen overnight. So who was our Secretary of Agriculture a few years ago? And who is our current Farm Bureau president right now? And what state are they from? Enough said. So what do? So we measure everything from corn production The transportation of the corn from the bins to the ethanol plant. We'll measure the amount of greenhouse gas emissions at the plant, the distribution cycle from the plant to the pump or to the distributors. Currently, ethanol right now in the Midwest has a score of 53.3 grams per megajoule. So that's current. So what do we want to get to? We want to get to this. We want to see that number go down. So farmers are going to be asked to do climate smart things. And I've got if you want this in a handout, I've got about 50 of them that explains this. So what we want to do, and the quickest way that a plant can get their score down is if we can get 40% of the corn that goes into that ethanol plant to achieve a zero, we can lower the CI score on ethanol real quick. The other way to do it is if the ethanol plant captures the CO2 at the plant and either puts it in a pipeline or injects it. So what are we going to do? The data required for a CI score. First of all, the inputs. First thing they're going to look at is corn yield. The more bushels per acre, inherently, that corn's going to have a lower score. It's going to look at all the energy inputs that went into that. Diesel, gas, natural gas, electricity. It's going to look at your fertilizer inputs, NP and K and other things. And then it's going to look at soil organic carbon. You know, where are you located? What are your farming practices? So if you're in, let's say, unirrigated Western Nebraska, it's not going to score very well. But if you're in a place that's got clay soils, moderate temperatures, and rainfall, your score is going to be better on the organic carbon. So then we're going to look at the plant, you know, the intensity scores there, and they're going to look at the results on the feedstocks with and without soil organic carbon, and they're going to give an estimate. So again, it's all the greenhouse gases that are emitted during the production from wheel to wheel. But you can actually go into the GREET model. I was there the other day. You can input all this. It's a little tedious. There are companies out there that will do it for you. One in particular, Mitch Hora, every Tuesday morning, he has a chat. His company is Continuum Ag for $500. He'll generate your CI score. So again, what does it mean for you? You could get, for the plants, they have to get to 50. Like I mentioned, their average is 56. They have to get to a score of 50 before the credits even start kicking in. So if they go from 50 down to 0, there is a potential at 2 cents per point that ethanol plant will get $1 per gallon credit. Now the question is, of that dollar, how much are they going to share with the farmer? People are somewhat estimating maybe a third might be a good number to think about. So theoretically, if your corn is a 0, it's really worth about $1.57 a bushel in the form of a tax credit. And it really determines how much. Now there's going to be upfront cost on the ethanol plant to do this. And so they're not going to give you the whole $1.57. But if they gave you 60 cents a bushel and your APH is 200, is that interesting? Okay. So that's 45Z and like as quick as I could do it. Other thing that's kind of interesting is 45Q, carbon capture and storage. This is I'm going to show you the pipeline map. But does anyone know how old this tax credit is? George Bush started this. That's how old it is. But the technology's finally got to the point. So Summit Carbon is the last one standing. Wolf and Navigator went out. Again, what is interesting in this is you go to Bismarck, North Dakota. Is anyone familiar with what's up there? Why are they taking the CO2 there? Has anyone ever heard of the Balkan Sands oil? But literally, they are able to use the CO2 to do oil recovery. Okay, now they've pledged that they're not going to do that, but they're going to inject the CO2 into bedrock. And I know what was in the bedrock. Climate smart commodities, $3 billion, 70 some projects across the United States. Grants range from 10 to $90 million. Again, 8 million to monitor soil carbon. I know this slide is not very good, but there are a lot of things that are or are not climate smart. But if you want, I can provide these. This came off of the USDA Senate Ag Committee's website. And so when we talk about different projects here in Ohio, there are 26 projects that Ohio growers might be eligible for, 37 different major commodities, 119 practices, and basically $960 million. Now, I've got all the projects up here in a binder, and what you're going to see is Ohio is mentioned with about 20 other states. And so if they're mentioned with 20 other states, that's how the number got so big. But when you look at who got the grants, very few land grant universities are the lead or principal investigator. It's ADM, it's Cargill, it's Tyson, it's McDonald's, it's PepsiCo. It's all of the companies that they partnered with that are behind this. This is one here about, this is the Iowa Soybean Association. Other major partners, PepsiCo, Cargill, Target, JBS, Coca-Cola. They got $95 million to try to source corn, soybeans, wheat, and sugar beets under sustainable practices. Truterra, you may want to talk to them out here. I've heard their people speak. They seem to have a pretty solid program. Truterra is a subsidiary of Land O'Lakes, and so they're working through a dealer network. Grown Climate Smart. This is DeLong. I have a DeLong facility in Pickaway County, and they're starting to ask farmers whether they would grow soybeans in a little bit different way in order to have a climate smart soybean. So just a couple more slides, 2 slides. I've used this. It doesn't seem to change. The future of carbon markets will continue to evolve. And I'm going to maybe paraphrase it. It's not going to be 1 to 2 years. Maybe it's going to be 5 to 10. It's still going to be a messy place. And that's the senior management person from Truterra. And the last thing, I've used this too. And generally, I've had a couple old farmers tell me this. Generally, if you really don't understand the programs, you don't understand what you may be signing up for, you just basically look at how much the check is. And so I think one of the things right now is there's still a lot of confusion. There's still a lot of gray area. Peggy's going to talk about the contractual part of it and the legal parts of these programs. But I think really the reason they haven't been widely adopted is they just haven't paid enough yet. So I know there's a panel later, so I'll take questions then.